My brother dragged me to meet his fiancée's multimillionaire father at the wedding, smirking. "This is our family failure." My parents added, "We don't brag about her." The man looked at me, froze, then said quietly, "So it's you? This is unexpected. My name is Claire Reed." Except it isn't, not entirely. The name on my driver's license is Claire Fisher. The name on the book that changed my life is M. Reed. And for a long time, those two names lived in completely separate worlds, on purpose, by design, because I had learned early that the people closest to me were the least likely to take me seriously. And I had made my peace with that arrangement long before a Saturday in October blew it apart in front of 300 people and a string quartet playing Pachelbel. My brother Liam has called me boring since we were teenagers, not in the vicious way that some siblings weaponize childhood, more in the dismissive way, the casual, offhand way, the way you describe furniture you inherited and have no particular attachment to. "She's fine. She's just kind of boring. She doesn't really do anything interesting." He said it at family dinners. He said it to his friends when they asked about me. He said it to my parents, who did not correct him, because correcting him would have required them to produce evidence to the contrary, and producing evidence would have required them to actually know what I did with my days. They didn't. Not really. And for most of my adult life, I let that be true, because the alternative was explaining myself to people who had already decided who I was. And I had learned, slowly and at some cost, that explaining yourself to people who have already decided who you are is one of the most exhausting things a human being can choose to do with their time. So I stopped choosing it. I stopped volunteering information at family dinners. I stopped correcting the record when my mother introduced me at church functions as doing something with writing, not sure exactly what. I stopped getting frustrated when Liam held court at Thanksgiving about his consulting firm, while I sat at the end of the table eating sweet potato casserole and saying very little. I built a life that didn't require their understanding to function. And then, because life has a sense of timing that borders on theatrical, I built something that turned out to matter enormously to a man my brother desperately needed to impress, and the whole quiet architecture of my silence came down in a single evening. But I'm getting ahead of myself. You need to understand the Fisher family first. You need to understand what it was like to grow up in that house. My parents, Robert and Diane Fisher, were good people in the way that many people are good, meaning they loved their children, worked hard, paid their bills on time, and carried certain blind spots so deep and so old that they had stopped being able to see them at all. My father spent 30 years in regional bank management. My mother taught elementary school until her knees gave out, then switched to tutoring. They lived in the same house in Asheville, North Carolina that they bought in 1989, a 4-bedroom colonial with a flagstone path and a garden my mother maintained, with the focus of a professional and the satisfaction of someone who needed visible proof that things she tended would grow. Liam was born first. 3 years later, I arrived. And in the way of families, the shape of things had already been decided before I was old enough to have any say in it. Liam was bright and loud and social in the way that reads as promise when you're 7 years old. He made friends easily. He talked to adults like a peer. He had opinions about things and delivered them with the confidence of someone who had never been told his opinions were wrong. My parents found this charming. Teachers found it charming. The whole apparatus of public school, which rewards a certain kind of legible, performative intelligence, found it charming. Liam moved through childhood collecting approval the way other kids collected baseball cards. I was different. I was quiet. I read constantly. I had a small number of friends I kept for years rather than a large number I rotated through seasonally. I did well in school without anyone noticing that I was doing well, because I didn't raise my hand much and I didn't talk about grades, and I had what one teacher once described to my mother as a very internal quality. My mother had nodded politely and then worried about me for 3 weeks. The thing I remember most about being a child in that house is watching how my parents looked at Liam versus how they looked at me. It wasn't hostility. I want to be clear about that. It wasn't cruelty. It was something more ordinary and in some ways harder to argue with, which was simple differential attention. When Liam spoke at the dinner table, my parents leaned forward. When I spoke, they listened, or something that looked like listening, but they did not lean. And a child notices these things. A child builds a model of the world from these things. And the model I built was, you are not the interesting one. I built other things too. That's what I did with being the uninteresting one. I read everything I could find. I kept notebooks full of observations that I never showed anyone. I developed what I later understood was a habit of watching people very carefully, of looking for the patterns in how they behaved, the distances between what they said and what they did, the ways that groups of people organized themselves around the loudest or the most confident member rather than the most capable one. I found this endlessly interesting. I also found it lonely because there was no one in my immediate orbit who spoke the same language. When I was 14, my grandmother on my father's side gave me a book for Christmas. It was a collection of essays by a social psychologist about group dynamics and decision-making, written for a general audience but rigorous enough to mean something. I read it twice in the same week. I underlined passages. I wrote notes in the margins. I had never felt so recognized by a piece of writing in my life, not because the author was describing my experience directly, but because she was using language to make sense of patterns I had been observing my entire life without having the vocabulary to name them. Something locked into place in my brain. I was going to spend my life doing something like this. I didn't know exactly what yet, but I knew it involved patterns and people, and the gap between what we believe about ourselves and what we actually do. Liam got a new snowboard for Christmas that year. My parents talked about it for a month. High school did not change the fundamental dynamics of the Fisher family, but it sharpened them. Liam became genuinely popular in the way that means something in a small city: athlete, class officer, brother, the kid who knew everyone at every party. He dated a girl named Kelsey for 2 years, who my mother adored on sight. My father went to every one of his basketball games and came home talking about plays I hadn't seen and probably wouldn't have understood. I did debate team. I was good at it. I won a regional competition my junior year with a case I had researched for 6 weeks and structured with precision that my coach described as genuinely unusual. My parents came to the final round. I remember my mother smiling when I walked to the podium. I remember my father's face, careful, neutral, holding something that might have been pride but did not know how to come forward. I won. We drove home mostly quiet. My father said, "Good job, Mer." My mother said, "You were very composed up there." And then Liam called from a friend's house, and my father laughed at something he said, and the conversation moved on. And I sat in the back seat watching the streetlights scroll past and understood, with the flat clarity of someone who has stopped being surprised, that this was how it was going to be. Not because they didn't love me. I believe they loved me in the way parents love their children by default. The ambient love that doesn't require maintenance because it's structural. But love and attention are different things. And attention was Liam's native currency. And I had no talent for collecting it. And after a while, I stopped wanting to. I went to UNC Chapel Hill on an academic scholarship. Liam went to Appalachian State on a partial athletic scholarship that my parents supplemented with money they had been saving for years. When I got my acceptance letter and the scholarship notification, my mother cried and said she was so proud. 2 days later, she was on the phone with Liam's coach, and the conversation about my scholarship was over. I am not telling you this to generate sympathy. I am telling you this because it is accurate, and accuracy matters to me more than most things. And understanding the Fisher family requires understanding that this was not unusual for us. This was just Tuesday. I studied psychology and organizational behavior at Chapel Hill. I was a serious student in the way that serious students are, which means I showed up to everything, read everything, questioned everything, and spent an amount of time in professors' office hours that probably alarmed some of them at first and delighted them eventually. I wrote papers that my professors passed around to colleagues. I did not know they were doing this until years later, when I ran into one of them at a conference and she said she still used my third-year paper on status dynamics in group decision-making as an example in her graduate seminar. I had not known. No one had told me. I had written it and handed it in and received an A and moved on to the next thing because that was how I operated. Do the work. Move on. Whether anyone noticed was beside the point. I graduated near the top of my class and went directly into a 2-year analyst position at a management consulting firm in Charlotte. This is where things began to accelerate, though I would not have described them that way at the time. At the time, I was just doing the work, which is what I had always done. The firm was mid-sized, established, the kind of place that had been around long enough to have institutional habits that no one questioned, and a client list that included regional hospitals, manufacturing companies, insurance firms, and a rotating cast of private equity-backed businesses that needed someone to tell them why their operations were leaking money. I was good at finding where the money was leaking. I was not good at performing the kind of confident, warm, solutions-forward energy that consulting firms prize in client-facing work. And so after 2 years, I moved into a research and analysis role that suited me considerably better. I spent 4 years doing deep dives into organizational dysfunction, decision-making failures, and the specific mechanics of how leadership breaks down when the people at the top stop being honest with themselves or each other. I kept notebooks the whole time. Habits from childhood. I filled 6 of them in 4 years. Observations and patterns and half-formed theories about why smart people in rooms together consistently made worse decisions than any one of them would have made alone. Why status anxiety warped perception in ways that were invisible to the people experiencing them. Why the most competent person in the room was so rarely the most influential one. I was not thinking about a book. I was thinking about understanding what I was seeing. The book came later, and it came sideways, the way most things in my life have arrived, not through intention, but through accumulated pressure finding an exit. The thing that finally pushed me to write was a project I worked on in my 4th year at the firm. A regional healthcare network had hired us to figure out why their executive leadership team was making decisions that their operational staff could see were wrong in real time, but that leadership kept implementing anyway. This is not an unusual problem. It is, in fact, one of the most common problems in organizational life. But this particular version of it was costing the network approximately $4 million a year in preventable operational failures, and their board was getting impatient, and so they brought us in. I spent 3 months embedded with that team. I attended their meetings. I read their internal communications. I interviewed everyone from the CEO down to the charge nurses who were watching decisions get made above them that they knew from the first day would fail. The pattern was textbook in some ways and singular in others. The leadership team had organized itself around the personality of a single executive who was extraordinarily confident, moderately competent, and constitutionally incapable of hearing information that contradicted his existing model of how things worked. And everyone around him had learned, over years of consequences, that the cost of disagreeing with him was higher than the cost of watching him be wrong. So they watched him be wrong, and they filed their observations in mental folders they never opened in meetings. And the organization suffered for it steadily and expensively. I wrote a report that was thorough and specific and included recommendations that addressed root causes rather than symptoms. My senior partner softened it significantly before it went to the client, because the unfiltered version would have required the board to acknowledge that their most senior executive was the primary source of the problem. And boards, in my experience, rarely hire consultants to be told that. The diluted report was well received. Some of the recommendations were implemented. The network continued to lose money at a somewhat reduced rate. The executive remained in his position for another 2 years before retiring with a handsome package. I left the firm 6 months later, not in anger, in recognition. I understood that the kind of work I wanted to do, the work of actually naming what was happening in organizational systems and explaining the mechanisms behind it clearly enough that people could recognize themselves in it and change, was not work that a consulting firm was going to let me do in its full form. The client relationship required softening. The retainer required a version of the truth that didn't alienate the people paying for it. I didn't blame the firm. It was a rational business model. It just wasn't mine. I was 29. I had savings. I had 6 notebooks full of material. I had a research background that was legitimately solid and 4 years of pattern recognition in environments that most people only knew from the outside. And I had, for most of my life, watched the wrong people get credit for things they didn't fully understand, while the people who actually understood them stayed quiet because speaking up cost more than it returned. I decided to write the book that I had been, without knowing it, preparing to write my entire life. I want to be honest about what that first year looked like, because I think people imagine that writing a book about organizational psychology is a tidy, linear, intellectually satisfying process, and it is not. It is 6 months of realizing that what you know and what you can articulate clearly enough for a stranger to understand are 2 entirely different things. It is throwing away 4 different structural approaches. It is writing 3 chapters that turn out to be 1 chapter. It is the specific despair of having something you know to be true and being temporarily unable to render it in language that doesn't sound either obvious or incomprehensible. I rented a small apartment in Charlotte. I took freelance research work to cover my expenses. I wrote every morning from 5 until 9 before the administrative noise of the day started. I filled 2 more notebooks with material I was working through. I talked to almost no one about what I was doing because I had no patience for the particular kind of encouragement that people offer when they don't understand what you're building and aren't sure it will succeed. My mother called every 2 weeks. She asked how the writing was going. I said fine. She said that was nice. She did not ask what it was about. Liam had started a consulting firm of his own by then. He called it Fisher Group Strategies, which I found quietly funny since Strategies was doing a lot of work in that name. He had 3 clients. He was working on a 4th. He was loud about all of it on social media in a way that seemed to generate a lot of engagement from people who confused confidence with competence, which I had come to understand was most people. My parents talked about Fisher Group Strategies at every family gathering. I heard updates secondhand through my mother's phone calls, delivered with the specific pride of parents who have one child whose accomplishments they can narrate to others. I finished the first draft of the book in 14 months. The process of finding a publisher took another 8. I had decided early that I wanted to use a pen name for 2 reasons. The first was professional. I was still doing some freelance consulting, and I did not want my consulting clients, who were paying for my judgment as an analyst, to know I was writing critically about the kinds of organizations they ran. The second reason was personal, and I understood it without wanting to examine it too closely at the time, which was that I did not want my family to know about it, not because I was ashamed, but because I had learned from a lifetime of experience that sharing things I cared about with people who did not know how to meet them cost me something I couldn't afford to keep losing. The pen name M. Reed came easily. Reed was my grandmother's maiden name, the one who had given me the psychology book when I was 14, the one who had sat with me at her kitchen table when I was 9 years old and asked me what I was thinking about in a tone that suggested she actually wanted to know. She had been dead for 6 years by the time I finished the manuscript. I put her name on it for reasons I didn't try to articulate. It felt right. That was enough. The book was called The Architecture of Agreement. It was about the specific mechanisms by which groups of intelligent people organize themselves around consensus rather than truth and what that costs them over time. It was written for a general audience but grounded in research. It was not a business book in the airport sense. It was not a self-help book. It occupied the space between academic work and accessible writing that very few books managed to find, and I had worked very hard to find it. I signed with a small but respected publisher who worked in the nonfiction space. My editor was a woman named Patricia, who had been in the industry for 20 years and who I liked immediately because she edited in a way that clarified rather than softened, which was the only kind of editing I could respect. We worked together for 4 months on the final version. The book came out in the spring, quietly, with a modest first printing and a marketing budget that could best be described as optimistic given the circumstances. For the first 2 months, nothing much happened. It sold reasonably in the markets it had targeted. It got some reviews in academic and professional publications that were warm and specific. A professor at Duke assigned it in his MBA leadership seminar and emailed the publisher to say it was the best book on group decision-making he had encountered in 15 years of teaching. That email was the first sign. What happened next is the part that I still find genuinely difficult to explain because the mechanisms of a book finding its audience are not entirely rational, and I am a person who prefers rational explanations. The book spread the way ideas spread when they name something that people have been experiencing without language for it. A chapter about what I called the confidence discount, the degree to which groups systematically undervalue accurate information delivered without performed certainty, got quoted in a Fortune article about a high-profile corporate failure. That quote sent 12,000 people to the book in a single week. A podcaster I had never heard of called it the most important thing he had read in 3 years and interviewed Patricia, my publisher, because I had declined the interview, and the episode was downloaded 400,000 times. By the end of the first year, the book had sold 80,000 copies. By the end of the second year, 190,000. It was translated into 11 languages. It was on the syllabus of 42 MBA programs. A professor in Singapore mentor wrote me a letter, actual mail, to tell me it had changed how he taught leadership. I know these numbers are impressive, and I want to be clear that I am not reciting them for that reason. I'm reciting them because they are the facts that explain why Gerald Calloway recognized my name, and understanding why he recognized my name is the only way to understand what happened at his daughter's wedding. Gerald Calloway was a private equity investor with a particular focus on organizational development. He had built Calloway Group over 30 years by doing something most private equity firms did not do, which was investing deeply in the leadership capacity of the companies he acquired rather than simply extracting value and moving on. He genuinely believed, based on decades of evidence, that the thing most limiting company performance was not capital or technology or market position, but the quality of decisions being made at the top. He had built an internal leadership development program that was, by several accounts, the best of its kind in private equity. His team had found my book in its second year of publication. They licensed it as the foundational text for their program, meaning every senior leader and board member at every Calloway portfolio company read it as part of their development process. Gerald had read it himself. His head of leadership development had written me a letter through my publisher describing what the book had done for their program and asking whether I would be available to consult or develop additional curriculum. I had received that letter. I had considered it for 3 weeks, and then I had declined politely through my publisher because I was working on the second book, and I had learned that consulting, even the kind I actually believed in, pulled me out of the thinking space that writing required, and the writing was what mattered most to me at that stage of my life. I did not know that the man who had sent that letter through my publisher was the father of the woman my brother was marrying. I did not know this because Liam had not told me anything substantive about Sienna's family, and I had not asked because Liam and I were not close in the way that produces that kind of conversation. We were family, which in the Fisher version of things meant we were present at required occasions and absent from each other's actual lives. I should tell you about the 18 months before the wedding because they matter. Liam's consulting firm had grown. He had 10 clients, a small team, and a reputation in Charlotte's business community built significantly on his ability to present ideas with confidence and significantly less on the ideas themselves. I observed this directly at a family dinner where my parents had invited a retired insurance executive. Liam spent 45 minutes describing a transformation strategy for a manufacturing client. The man asked 2 questions, polite in delivery, genuinely probing in content. Liam answered both with confidence in a direction that slightly missed the point. The neighbor looked at his wife, a small look, the kind you only catch if you are watching for the space between what is said and what is registered. I was watching. Liam called to tell me he was getting married on a Sunday in June. I was at my desk working through chapter 4 when he called. He told me about Sienna. He told me about the ring, $42,000, a figure he delivered with the specificity of someone expecting a reaction. He told me the wedding would be at the Calloway estate. I said, Calloway, as in Gerald Calloway? And Liam said, yeah, she's his daughter. It's a whole thing. His family has a lot of money. The estate is incredible. I sat with that for a moment. And then I said, congratulations. And I meant it genuinely. Because whatever else was true about Liam, he was my brother, and he was getting married, and I was capable of being glad for that independently of everything else. What I did not do was mention that Gerald Calloway's firm had licensed my book. I did not mention that his head of leadership development had written to me through my publisher. I did not mention that Gerald Calloway almost certainly knew the name M. Reed. These things were mine. I had built them quietly. I saw no reason to deploy them in a phone call I hadn't asked for, about a wedding I wasn't sure I wanted to attend. The invitation arrived 2 months later. It was beautiful, heavy cardstock, gold lettering, the kind of invitation that announces itself. My name was spelled correctly, which I mention only because it had been misspelled on the last 2 pieces of family correspondence I'd received, once with an extra E, once with an A. Below my name, handwritten, in Liam's handwriting, please come. It matters. Please come. It matters. From a man who had called me boring in front of other people for most of my adult life. From a man who had taken an organizational framework from my published work and used it in his practice without knowing it was mine. Please come. It matters. I thought about not going. I thought about it seriously for about 10 days. I made pro and con lists in my notebook, the way I did with decisions I couldn't work through by thinking alone. The cons were longer. The pro list had 3 items, one of which was, it matters to Liam and I love my brother, complicated as that is, and one of which was, I am tired of shrinking, and one of which was, I have spent 33 years being invisible to these people, and I am done deciding that this is comfortable. I called my mother and confirmed I would attend. She said, oh good, very organized family, don't wear anything attention-getting. Liam gets sensitive when things aren't about the wedding. I said I would wear something appropriate. I did not promise to be invisible. I want to be clear about something before I get to the wedding itself. I did not go to that event planning what happened. I did not know Gerald Calloway would be there in the way I understood him to be there, meaning as someone who already knew my work. I had not engineered a confrontation. I am not a person who engineers confrontations. I am a person who watches patterns and waits for systems to reveal themselves, and systems, given enough time, always do. What I had decided was simpler and more personal. I had decided to go to my brother's wedding as myself, not as the family footnote, not as the one they don't brag about, not as the quiet one who absorbs whatever narrative the room assigns her and adjusts her posture accordingly, as myself. Which meant, if someone asked what I did, I would say. Which meant, if someone introduced me dismissively, I would not perform gratitude for it. Which meant I was going to stand at full height in that room and be exactly who I was, and let the consequences of that be whatever they were going to be. That was the whole plan. That was all all I brought to the estate in October. The estate was 40 minutes outside Charlotte, down roads that narrowed gradually as they wound into hills. The grounds were the kind of beautiful that announces money that has been in place long enough to look like landscape rather than investment. Rolling lawn, mature trees, a stone manor house that glowed in the late afternoon light in a way that the architect had probably intended and achieved. A string quartet was set up near the entrance, playing something I recognized as Ravel. The champagne flutes were arranged on silver trays carried by staff in black vests. My dress was navy. Simple, clean lines, no jewelry, except the watch my grandmother had given me when I turned 21. A plain steel watch that kept perfect time and looked like nothing and meant everything. My mother would have preferred I wore something that faded further into the background, which was precisely why I had chosen this dress when I'd bought it 2 years ago for a conference I'd ultimately skip. I found my seat, table 11, near a side exit and a large potted plant that had been positioned with the care of a decorator and the function of a room divider. I sat down and watched my brother get married. The ceremony was in the stone garden at the edge of the estate, surrounded by roses that had been cultivated over years into the specific kind of fullness that looks effortless and is not. Sienna was beautiful in the way that photographs will record accurately and still somehow fail to capture. She looked like a woman who knew exactly where she was and had chosen to be there. I liked her, in the abstract way that you can like someone you've never spoken to based entirely on how they hold themselves in a high-pressure moment. Liam cried. They were not entirely rehearsed tears. Some of them were real. I want to give him that. My parents were in the second row. My mother wore lavender, which suited her. My father wore a tie that didn't quite match his jacket, which was typical because my father had never been the kind of man who paid close attention to the visual register. He was looking at Liam with the expression he reserved for moments of genuine feeling, a kind of compressed, careful warmth that he did not know how to release in full, but that was visible anyway if you had spent your life learning to read him. I saw it, and it cost me something small and precise, seeing it, because I understood that he had that expression available, and I had simply never been the subject of it. The cocktail hour began on the terrace at 6. The evening was cool and clear. I found a position near the interior bar, slightly apart from the larger clusters of guests, and held a glass of sparkling water and watched the room organize itself the way rooms always do, around the loudest, the most confident, the most visibly important. Gerald Calloway entered the terrace at 6:15. After a delay I later understood was photographs with the wedding party. His entrance shifted the energy in the way that the entrances of genuinely powerful people do. Not loudly, not performatively, but perceptibly. A change in the barometric pressure of the room, people orienting slightly without quite knowing they were doing it. He was taller than I had imagined. Lean, gray at the temples, wearing a suit that sat on him with the ease of something he had stopped thinking about years ago. He was the kind of man who had moved through enough rooms that he had stopped performing for them and had simply begun inhabiting them, which is a very particular quality and not a common one. His handshake when he greeted people was brief and direct. He didn't smile reflexively. He listened to what people said before he responded to it. I noticed all of this from across the terrace because noticing is what I do, and because I recognized in his movement patterns the specific signature of someone who reads rooms the way I read rooms. Sienna brought him through the crowd toward a table where my parents were seated. Liam intercepted them, or rather Liam materialized in their path with the particular energy of a man who has been watching for an entrance. He was glowing, performing his best version of himself, which was genuinely good if you didn't know him well enough to see the effort underneath it. I watched from my position at the bar. I did not try to get closer. I was not managing the situation. I was simply present in it, which turned out to be enough. Liam found me 15 minutes later. He came across the terrace with a champagne flute in one hand and the expression of someone who has been tracking a variable they need to position correctly. He took my elbow, not unkindly, and began walking me toward the small circle that had formed around Gerald. On the way, he said 2 things. He said, "This is the most important night of my professional life," which I thought was an interesting thing to describe your wedding as. And he said, "Just be normal, Mur, and don't go into detail about anything and let me do the talking." I said nothing. I let him steer me. Gerald was speaking to a man I didn't recognize when Liam broke into the circle. He did it smoothly enough, with the specific social confidence that was his most genuine skill, the ability to insert himself into a conversation in a way that felt like an invitation rather than an interruption. He introduced Sienna's uncle. He introduced one of the firm's partners. He introduced my parents, who performed their warmth on cue. And then he turned to me with the grin, the one I had been watching my entire life, the one that was equal parts charm and armor, and he said it clearly enough for the surrounding cluster of guests to hear. "This is our family failure." He laughed immediately after, the way people do when they're using humor as a vehicle for something they actually mean. The laugh that says it's a joke while the thing being said is not. My mother, who had been waiting nearby with the timing of someone who is rehearsed, added hers. "We don't brag about her." She said it to Gerald's wife Patricia, lightly, with the smile she used for this line. The comfortable smile of a woman delivering a line she'd said enough times that it no longer required her to feel it. Patricia smiled back with the polite uncertainty of someone who wasn't sure if she was supposed to laugh. I stood still. My hands were at my sides. My back was straight. I did not perform the good-natured sister who absorbs the joke. I did not smile along. I did not look at the floor. I looked directly at Gerald Calloway, with the same expression I wore in every meeting where someone underestimated the analysis I was about to present. Gerald did not laugh. He had been looking at Liam when Liam delivered the line. His expression had been the careful neutral of a man who does not react to social cues before he has processed them. And then he turned to look look at me. The way you turn to look at something that has made a sound you weren't expecting. And something changed in his face. Not dramatically. Not with a gasp or a double take or any of the visible theatrics that moments like this produce in films. His brow drew together slightly. His lips pressed in. He went completely still. And then he said it quietly enough that it did not perform for the crowd but carried further than he probably intended, because the string quartet had paused between movements, and the particular stillness of outdoor evenings in October creates a silence that carries sound. "So it's you," he said. "This is unexpected." 6 words. That was all it took. Liam's grin did not disappear. It disconnected. The smile was still present on the lower half of his face, but the information in his eyes had changed completely. From confidence to confusion to something beginning to look like the early stages of a calculation he hadn't been expecting to run. He laughed, the shorter, flatter laugh of a man buying time. "You two know each other?" Gerald did not look at him. He was still looking at me. He reached into the inner pocket of his jacket, unhurried, with the specific deliberateness of someone who is not performing urgency, and he pulled out his phone. He opened something. He turned the screen toward me. It was the cover of my book, Gray Spine, the title in clean serif type, and beneath it, in smaller type, the name, M. Reed. "We have been trying to reach you for 2 years, he said, for an expanded curriculum license. Your publisher's position has been consistent. The author doesn't do meetings." He said it without accusation. It was a statement of fact, a man presenting data. I looked at the cover for a moment. My cover. The cover I had seen 10,000 times in thumbnail on a screen and a handful of times in physical form in a bookstore. Always briefly, always while walking past, never while standing still, because standing still in front of it felt like something I wasn't ready to do in public. I looked at him. "I'm the author," I said. What happened in the next 4 seconds, I have replayed more times than I can count. Not because it was dramatic, because it was the clearest moment I have ever experienced of a truth reorganizing a room. Liam's champagne glass stopped moving. He was mid-gesture, mid-drink, and his hand simply held where it was, suspended. My mother turned from Patricia Calloway mid-sentence, and whatever she had been saying dissolved before it completed itself. My father, who had been standing slightly behind my mother with the quiet patience of a man who knows he is not the center of the current scene, went still in a way that was different from his usual stillness. This stillness had a tension in it. Gerald studied me for a moment with an expression that was doing several things at once. Recognition, obviously, and beneath that something that looked like the professional equivalent of a man realizing he had been standing next to what he was looking for without knowing it. He looked at Liam, not sharply, not with anger. The way you look at a misattribution that has just been corrected. Then he looked back at me. "I have a standing offer," he said. "The terms are outlined in the proposal my team sent through your publisher 18 months ago. It remains open. I want you to know that." He paused. "Whenever you're ready." He said it the way people say things when they have made a decision about someone that they are confident in and are not seeking validation for, not performing generosity, not positioning, just stating a fact to the person it concerned. I said I would be in touch. Liam said nothing. My mother said nothing. Patricia Calloway looked between her husband and me with the expression of a woman who has been married to a private equity investor for 30 years and can read the specific register of a moment when something has shifted in his professional attention. The string quartet started up again somewhere to the left. Pachelbel's canon, which has the slightly absurd quality of feeling both intimate and inevitable, and the music floated over the silence in our small circle, and the party continued around us. 300 people celebrating a wedding, most of them entirely unaware that in a cluster of 7 people near the terrace bar, the architecture of the Fisher family had just been quietly and permanently rearranged. Liam found his voice eventually. He said something about how I had never told him, which was true. He said something about how I could have mentioned it, which was also technically true and almost entirely beside the point. He said quietly, so only I could hear, "This is not what tonight was supposed to be, Mur." I looked at him, not with triumph, not with satisfaction, with the specific clarity of someone who has been waiting a very long time for a room to see them accurately and has finally stopped waiting. "I didn't plan this," I said. "I came because you asked me to. And when someone asked me a question, I answered it. That's all." He held my gaze for a moment, and I saw something move through his expression that was not quite guilt and not quite anger, something older and harder to name. The recognition that runs through people when they realize they have built a story about someone that cannot withstand the contact of facts. He turned and walked back toward the center of the reception. My mother followed him after a moment, with the particular purpose of a woman who needs to manage a situation that has gotten away from her. My father stayed. He stood next to me for a moment without speaking, which was how my father expressed most things. Then he said, quietly, and without looking at me, "I didn't know." "I know," I said. "Why didn't you tell us?" It wasn't a question exactly. It had the register of a question that already knows part of its own answer. I said, "Because I needed it to be mine. Before anyone had an opinion about it. I needed it to be mine first." He was quiet for a moment. Then he nodded. The small, compressed nod of a man processing something he cannot fully articulate, but will carry. He went to find my mother. Gerald Calloway found me 20 minutes later near the entrance to the Stone Manor house. The reception was in full flow around us, and I had been standing briefly alone, looking out at the estate grounds in the October dark, the kind of darkness that holds the outline of things rather than obscuring them. He came and stood beside me and did not open with pleasantries. "I owe you a direct conversation," he said. "Separate from tonight, my team's proposal was serious and the offer stands. But I also want to say, without the professional frame, that the work you've done has mattered. I've seen it matter to people in rooms where it counted." I said thank you, and I meant it, not as performance, but as a genuine acknowledgement that when someone who understands what you have built tells you that it mattered, word, it means something, even when you have spent a long time practicing not needing it to. He nodded and went back to his daughter's wedding. I stayed for another hour. I ate the dinner that was served. It was excellent. I drank 1 glass of champagne. I talked to Sienna for 7 minutes near the end of the evening, while Liam was occupied across the room. She was warm and direct and clearly very smart, and she had chosen a man who was charming and insufficiently self-aware, which is a choice women have been making since the beginning of organized social life, and which I was not in a position to adjudicate. I said, "You're going to be fine." She looked at me for a moment and then said, "I know." I drove home through the October dark. The roads unwound from the estate's hills back toward the city. I had the windows down because the air had the particular quality of early fall that I have always found useful for thinking, cold enough to be clarifying, not yet cold enough to be punishing. I thought about the blue notebook on my desk at home, the one with the first 40 pages of the second book, the one I had been fighting with for 6 months. I thought about the structural problem in chapter 4 that I had been circling without landing, the problem of how to write clearly about the cost of performed certainty to people who have spent their lives rewarding it. I thought I knew how to write it now. I had seen it close enough to touch this evening, in a group of people I had known my whole life, and the clarity of it was sharp and clean and workable. I got home at midnight. I made tea. I sat at my desk and opened the notebook and wrote for 3 hours without stopping. And when I stopped, it was not because I had run out, but because the chapter was done, structurally whole and honest in the specific way that the work has to be honest, or it isn't worth handing to anyone. I went to bed at 3 in the morning and slept better than I had in months. 2 days later, I emailed Gerald Calloway's team through my publisher's office. I said I was open to a conversation about the proposal. I said I had some conditions about how the curriculum would be used and attributed. I said I would send a detailed response within the week. Then I made coffee, sat at my desk, opened my notebook, and went back to work. The book was what mattered. It always had been. The rest of it, the estate and the champagne and the family failure and the string quartet and the look on my brother's face when the room reorganized itself around a truth he hadn't planned for, all of it was context. All of it was data. And what I had always known, and what I had always been willing to let take its time in becoming visible, was that data eventually tells the truth. You just have to have built something real enough that when someone with eyes looks at it, they know what they're seeing. I had built something real. That had always been enough. It just hadn't always been visible. It was now.